Good afternoon and welcome back to the Galway Film Fleadh and to this afternoon's screening of The Sheriff. My name is Fitzgearld, programmer here at the Fleadh, and it's my pleasure to present this fantastic documentary as part of this year's lineup. And it's my privilege to be joined now by the director Grace Sweeney and by Mike Lawler, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at University of New Haven. Thanks a million for joining me this morning, folks.
Pleasure.
I say it this morning. It's morning where you are, Mike. It's later in the afternoon for us, but thanks for being here, everyone. And well done on a fantastic film. Judging by the reactions online, I think everyone really enjoyed it as much as I did. I suppose if we just get stuck in, and I'll start throwing some questions at you. Grace, right off the bat, I kind of know the premise going into this that it's going to follow the local elections, a sheriff race. But then right off the bat, Chuck Jenkins starts talking about immigration, and he starts showing his, their ICE facility and his local department. And I suppose really that is what the film is ultimately about then, isn't it?
Yeah, it's, it was impossible to kind of get away from when we were over there. Immigration was the big topic everybody was talking about. And it was such a huge issue in those elections. So we knew we wanted to do a film about the sheriff, and we knew we wanted to follow this election leading up to the midterm. And we just kind of had to roll with what the issues were whenever we got over there.
Yeah. And so how did you find your candidates for this? I mean, was the idea in your head, the premise that you would follow a local election and then you went searching for the characters, or how did it work?
Exactly, yeah. So the development was a beast of this film. Claire Burgoyne and I and Michael Fanning were, I think I drove them both half mad in the development of it. And there were certain decisions we had to make for quite kind of simple production reasons. Like we knew we needed a Democrat and a Republican to give us production value in the film. So we had like a longer filming period. So that kind of narrowed down the search a little bit. Chuck has quite a big profile as well. He would be quite well known. He had kind of mixed with Trump. So featuring somebody like that in the film, we thought would be really interesting because it would kind of open up, like getting into that bigger picture and kind of getting into federal politics as well. So we just kind of cast it that way, and certain people agreed, and we went over and we met people and we interviewed people, and we ended up with two really strong characters that were able to tell us two completely different sides of politics in America.
Absolutely. And then where did Clarence come into things, or at what point?
Clarence was there very, very early on. We had approached him pretty much the first development cycle we had been over, and we had met Clarence. And Durham's such an interesting place, and I mean, you can see from the news archive, the issues that were happening there again, like were happening on the national scale, and the scope of what we would be able to talk to Clarence about, and the issues that were going on within the community in Durham were, for me as a filmmaker, just so interesting. The idea of activism and community kind of coming together. There was just so much that we'd be able to do there.
Yeah. And tell me, given everything that's happened this past year, I mean, sure you had wrapped production on the film, but obviously policing in the US is under massive scrutiny now. Have you touched base with Frederick and Durham counties, and what was 2020 like for them?
Yeah, it continues to be a challenge. As soon as the film wrapped, there was a lot of issues with ICE kind of going in Durham, and that was a problem that they can continue to have. There's been protests in Frederick, so pretty much most of the scenes of the film are kind of still playing out today in both areas.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be fascinating to do a sequel, perhaps. We'll let you get this one out there first. Yeah. Mike, I wanted to, again, just kind of touching on everything that's happened this past year. I mean, your telephone, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to a professor of criminal justice about this stuff. I mean, your telephone line must be blown up. You must be doing a lot of these, I imagine, as everyone's looking again at sort of policing in the US. For me as a programmer of a film festival, it's interesting. Since 2016, we've seen so many US political documentaries. And in the beginning, they were sort of all about Trump, and they were all about the bigger picture. And then as we're closing in the next election, we now see a lot more sort of digging in to the heartland, sort of like in Grace's film. and looking at how a lot of these systemic issues are really, they're just that, they're grassroots, and a lot of them seem to be in conversation with each other. This past year, I've seen documentaries on gerrymandering, as well as things like local elections. You know, it does seem also so interconnected, and from an outsider's perspective, it seems like, does the whole system have to be broken down fundamentally and start over to fix, you know, these basic big picture issues?
Well, maybe, who knows, right? And I think to your earlier question to Grace, I just want to point out that as this campaign for sheriff was unfolding in Maryland, keep in mind that President Trump, I mean, this is the context of the midterm elections, which turned out to be a huge Democratic tidal wave throughout the country. The president was talking incessantly about Mexican caravans approaching the border in the south of the United States, and that seemed to have been the strategy of Republicans nationwide. So I think that's why, among other things, it was the central issue even in the sheriff's campaign on a very local level. And even with that, you know, you saw the outcome was the Republican only won with 51% of the vote, which is close by anybody's standards. So yeah, there's a lot of structural problems in the United States. And, you know, one obvious example is the Electoral College. I mean, I think, as everyone knows, President Trump actually lost the national popular vote 4 years ago, but won because smaller states tend to have a bigger voice in this Electoral College that technically chooses the president. So that's one proposal that's floating around, but to make that change requires an amendment to our national constitution, which is a very elaborate and difficult process. So who knows? I mean, we'll find out in, I guess, what is it, 4 months now before our next election, and you know, people are hoping for sure.
You know, it's kind of fascinating, and I'd be interested for either one of you to weigh in. You know, a documentary about a sheriff, it's almost kind of in conversation with a lot of classic American cinema. You know, we think about the Western, and we think about, you know, sort of America as the frontier, and the law is kind of written by whoever's the biggest gun. And that might seem hyperbolic to say, but your film, Grace, really it paints a picture of a place where, you know, those sort of attitudes are ingrained.
I mean, the sheriff, like Chuck himself, would even kind of talk about how he loves old Western films, and he really grew up admiring you know, sheriff figures on TV, and that is, I think, has influenced people consciously or subconsciously into what they think a sheriff is. And electing law enforcement, Mike and I talked about this a lot during the week, to a lot of people is a really strange concept. We wouldn't kind of think about that over here. It would be very, very strange, but to a lot of people in America, that's a really important thing to do. It's kind of like a bedrock democracy. You know, we pick the people who we kind of put in charge. And I think the sheriff is kind of the ultimate symbol of that in a lot of ways.
Yeah. You know, and if I could just add, it's interesting, you know, apart from being a professor, I spent a long time as an elected legislator in our state legislature here in Connecticut. And we had county sheriffs up until 20 years ago, when a variety of scandals resulted in a complete elimination of the sheriff system in Connecticut. And I'm guessing that's one of the reasons that Grace tracked me down here. But I do think the sheriff system nationally is somewhat archaic for a variety of reasons. You know, the debates that are going on right now are all about professionalism and standards and education and trainings and oversight. And you really get very little of that with these very extremely autonomous elected officials. You know, unlike in a European system where there's a party platform and there tends to be much more structure to decision making, an elected sheriff here is pretty much his or her own boss. I mean, they can do whatever they want to do once they're elected. And I think that's where you get into trouble. And you know, who knows if we'll see that in Frederick County, but it is definitely something that happened here in Connecticut.
Yeah. I wonder, you know, I know, Grace, that Trevor Burney was a producer on this film, and yesterday we chatted to him about his new film, The Dakota Entrapment Tapes, where we kind of looked at how, you know, with all the resources that these local police departments are given and the lack of oversight that they have, over-policing tends to then kind of create more crime in itself. Now, you spent time embedded with these sheriff's departments. Did you see any of that in action?
No, I mean, we didn't see any of that in action, really. We went on a lot of ride-alongs. I mean, there's a lot of drug enforcement kind of going on. A lot of people worried about drugs in the community, the opioid crisis. So we saw a lot of that reflected in the policing that was kind of happening. I suppose with the sheriffs that we were filming with who were involved in immigration, like that's a concern with, how that kind of plays out in the community and what that kind of policing looks like. And I certainly think that that's why in this specific election it became such a big issue, because like how do you trust policing if it feels like a certain group of people are going to be targeted or kind of looked at? And that's definitely my kind of takeaway with filming with them.
Yeah. Mike, can I ask you, since everything has happened with the, since George Floyd died and the protests that we've seen in the US, one of the sort of, the chants that we've heard so much of is defund the police. And I wanted to ask you, I suppose, what does that mean to you, and to what extent is it realistic?
So I think if you asked 100 people who advocated to defund the police, you'd get 100 very different answers. I think what it means to me, my takeaway is that the role of the police should be restricted. In other words, we ask our police officers in the US to do so many different things, most of which they're not really well trained to deal with: mental illness, substance abuse, children who have been traumatized. I think what you're seeing now emerging is a hope that we can create sort of a new construct, whether it's part of a police department or totally independent of it, people that would respond to calls for assistance that don't involve actual danger at the moment. So what I'm picturing, and I think maybe it's something you're more accustomed to in the Republic there, is, unarmed individuals showing up without a badge, maybe with a polo shirt of some type and an insignia, but trying to deal with people's everyday problems. The vast majority of calls to the police asking for help don't involve situations which pose an actual and imminent danger. And I think creating an entity that can respond to that, as opposed to the heavily armed, uniformed, typically militaristic people that our police are trained to be, is what defund the police means to me. Shifting money to an intervention that's way more effective and a lot less destructive.
Yeah, and we've seen that it does often always come back to money as well. Do either of you see anyone running on that kind of a platform in the near future?
Well, I'm a Democrat. I'm supporting Vice President Biden, and just yesterday he gave an elaborate speech about the meaning of race to him and the role the criminal justice system plays in it. So you can see in his own platform an endorsement of the concept of creating something other than uniformed armed people to respond to routine calls for help. And I think that shrinking that footprint of traditional law enforcement in the U.S. is part of the Democratic platform this year, at least.
Grace?
Not the sheriffs I filmed with. I don't think. Not where we were. I don't know. It's so complicated, and I suppose policing is different in America just because more Americans own guns. It's going to change the dynamics there, and that's not something that police in other parts of the world generally have to worry about as much. So, you definitely get a sense of a job being quite dangerous, being quite demanding whenever you're filming with them. I'm not sure I'd be cut out for it. So I think I don't know. I don't know is the short answer. Nobody I filmed with, I can't see it.
Sure. Just speaking of being cut out for it, I'm just curious to ask you, this is your first feature film, correct? How did you come to make this, this is your feature debut?
So it started with, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about a missing persons investigation, and the family and the sheriff had decided that the person was voluntarily missing. And they said some kind of throwaway comment that they were waiting for the election so they could rally support against the sheriff to get him pushed out so they could change the status of their case. And it just started this snowball. I didn't realize sheriffs were elected, started kind of looking into them. I suppose Ashley kind of makes the point in the film about sheriffs kind of becoming more visible in the lead up to the 2016 election. And you kind of started seeing these stories and these characters emerging. And I kind of pitched it to Michael, I think, on the way to Recce and other shoots. I was like, hey, I heard this thing about sheriffs. Sounds like it could be a pretty cool film. And we just started developing it. And, you know, we got a little bit of development money from North Ireland Screen, and we went out and we shot a taster tape. And, you know, it's 3 years in the making now, to kind of get it to where it is as part of Galway.
Brilliant, well done. Again, really positive reaction to the film online. Lots of great comments coming in. One in particular, Mike, from Joshua Tyne, who says, way to represent University of New Haven, Professor Lawler.
Former student. There you go.
I want to wrap things up before we get on to the next film, but just to quickly ask, since we're talking about elections, Mike, you mentioned you're supporting Vice President Biden. Is that who's going to win in November?
Well, after the 2016 election, I've given up predicting these things. He's certainly comfortably ahead at the moment, and it seems that the current president is working hard to eliminate whatever little support he had to start with. So who knows? But fingers crossed, and I think I speak for a lot of Americans.
Grace, any predictions?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't a clue. Again, like Mike said, we all thought we knew it in 2016, and we were all very wrong. So I hope there's a change in the guard. But, you know.
Sure. Well, I think if we had more documentaries like The Sheriff around pre-2016, we probably all would have had a better idea of you know, what we were dealing with back then. Again, terrifically insightful doc and brilliantly made. Well done. And thanks to you for being here, and thanks to Mike as well. Cheers for joining me at the Galway Film Festival.
Thanks so much for having us. It's been
Congratulations, Grace. You did a great job.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Slán.